Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Social Critic. My name is Sohail Shakeri, and it is my great privilege and honor to be here with you today with our very special guest, Dr. Thomas Cowan. Many of you have already heard of Dr. Cowan from his amazing, inspiring, and controversial views that have been spread far and wide in recent months, especially around the COVID lockdown that we have been experiencing all around the world. His work is groundbreaking in various realms, and it's a great privilege to be here with him today. And so I am going to tell you a little bit more about Dr. Cowan's background, and then we will jump right into things. Dr. Thomas Cowan was born and raised near Detroit, Michigan, and received an undergraduate degree in zoology at Duke University in 1977. After college, he spent 2 years teaching gardening as a Peace Corps volunteer in Swaziland, Southern Africa. During his Peace Corps years, he was introduced to the work of both Rudolf Steiner and Weston A. Price, who were to have a great influence on the rest of his life and career. After the Peace Corps, he went on to medical school at Michigan State University, receiving his MD degree in 1984. He set up a general medicine practice in 1985, where his focus was on nutrition and anthroposophical medicine. After a few years in New York State, he moved with his family to Peterborough, New Hampshire. During his 17 years there, he became the Vice President of Physicians for Anthroposophical Medicine, and along with Sally Fallon Morell, helped found the Weston A. Price Foundation, where he still serves on the board as its Vice President. In 1998, he wrote, along with Sally Fallon and Jamin Macmillan, the first of his 6 books, The Fourfold Path to Healing. In 1999, he married Linda Smith, and in 2003, they moved to San Francisco, where he refounded his general medicine practice. Since 2003, he has written 5 other books: The Nourishing Traditions Book of Baby and Child Care, along with Sally Fallon Morell, How and Why to Eat More Vegetables, Human Heart, Cosmic Heart, Vaccines, Autoimmunity, and the Changing Nature of Childhood Illness, and Cancer and the New Biology of Water. The last 3 published by Chelsea Green. He had continued to work and live in San Francisco until recently. In the past few years, along with his 2 sons, Asher and Joe, Dr. Cowan started 2 businesses. Dr. Cowan's Garden, which focuses on his love of food and gardening, and Human Heart, Cosmic Heart, which provides strophanthus and other natural medicines to a wider audience. Dr. Cowan is an avid gardener, and perhaps one of his proudest accomplishments is growing about 80% of the plants he and his family consume. He has 3 grown children, 1 stepson, 5 grandchildren, with 1 more on the way, and loves to take as many walks on the beach as possible with his beloved Linda. Dr. Cowan, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And actually, we do have 6 grandchildren now.
Oh, wonderful. Congratulations. Excellent. Great. So I think it would be great for you to start us off, Dr. Cowan, with the foundation, really, of the hysteria, the fear, and a lot of the misperceptions that we see in our society around science, around medicine, that has become so politicized and influencing our lives all around the world. And that is germ theory, and the history of germ theory, and just walking us through how we got to this place where people have become so afraid of this virus, as it is, said in the media. So I would love for you to give us that background and overview for all of our viewers and listeners.
Okay. So it's a kind of an interesting history. Of course, we didn't learn this in medical school. You have to go and figure it out for yourself. But here's basically my understanding of the history of it's both germ theory and the history of contagion. And when I say that, the idea that sickness is contagious, meaning it can spread from one person to another, is, really an old observation. It goes even back to Greek times and probably even further back. And what I mean by that is pretty much everybody now and probably then has had the experience of somebody gets sick in a certain way, and then somebody else around that gets sick in the same way, and we say that person must have spread something to the next person. And the first thing I would say is it's a very sort of intuitive understanding and a very clear observation. So that goes back, literally thousands of years because people observed something like that. And they sort of didn't know what to make of it, and nobody said much about it as far as I could tell until around the 1850s or so. Now, I would also point out that, between 2,000 years ago and 1850, there were a lot of other kind of medicines: Chinese medicine, Native American medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, homeopathy, etc. And interestingly, none of them had the idea that diseases were contagious. So that was not something that you ever see in Chinese medicine. They don't have that concept. Same with Ayurvedic medicine. But still, it was an observation. And the trouble was nobody could see what was being spread between one person or one animal and another. And then with the invention of the light microscope, they could eventually, people, doctors, scientists could eventually see that this person was sick, and they looked in their blood or in their sputum or whatever, in their urine, and they could see bacteria smaller than you could see with the naked eye. And that was a kind of the first eureka moment. That's the cause of the disease. These living things called bacteria. They live in a person. They must make some poison or digest your tonsils or your lungs, and that's what's causing you to be sick. And then they would look in the next person who got the same sickness, and they would find the same bacteria, and that sort of clinched it. This person must have coughed a bacteria onto the next person, and that's why they got sick, and that's what we mean by contagion, and that's the germ theory. Now, around 1850, when they started seeing this, they—
sorry, Dr. Cowan, if I may. So I just want to understand. So that first part that you just outlined. So because people were so physicians, researchers were able to identify bacteria in the feces, they then drew the conclusion then that, oh, this must be causing the disease. So what was it you were saying? Could you just elaborate on that?
Let's say somebody had pneumonia or a cough.
Okay.
Look into their sputum, their respiratory secretions,
okay,
and they would find a bacteria. And they would say, that means this bacteria caused this person to have pneumonia. And then they would look at the next person with pneumonia, and they had the same bacteria sometimes. Okay. And that's basically the germ theory. Now, the way that I think everybody should understand this is the example I use. Let's say you have a cow, and for whatever reason you decide not to feed the cow proper cow food, which is grass and pasture and things like that. So instead, you feed the cow cardboard and dead cow parts and grains, and you soak it in arsenic and you soak it in glyphosate, and you poison the cow, and the cow's sick, and we know that all those poisons come out in the milk. So then you have milk from a sick cow, and somebody drinks the milk, and they get sick with, say, diarrhea. And then the question for doctors and scientists was, why did they get sick? So they looked in the milk, and they would see a bacteria called Listeria. And then they would look in the stool, the feces of the person who was sick, and they would see the same bacteria, Listeria. And that was it. The Listeria caused, you drank milk that had Listeria bacteria in it, Listeria causes diarrhea, and you find it in the person's stool. And again, that's the germ theory. There is, however, another way to understand that same situation. So again, you improperly feed the cow, you feed the cow poisons, and then the bacteria, which are always around. You see, these people also thought that every living being, including the human being, was completely sterile inside. So there was no bacteria living in your gut, in your mouth, in your throat, in your stool, anywhere. That's what they thought. And that the only bacteria in you came from the outside and were pathogens, in other words, making you sick. So when they saw bacteria like Listeria, they said that must have come from the outside. But now we know that Listeria spores are always around. And if you feed it certain things, like certain poisons, that causes the Listeria to grow. And they're not causing any trouble. They're biodegrading the poisons that are in the milk. Now,
Wow.
I would point out that if you look into nature in every other situation, for instance, if you have a compost pile and you put dead squirrels in the compost pile, you will get some funky bacteria living on the dead squirrels. Nobody says the compost pile has an infection. They say that the bacteria are biodegrading the squirrels. And the proof of that is if you take those bacteria and you put them into a healthy compost pile, they don't grow. They will grow if you put dead squirrels in the next compost pile. Then those same funky bacteria will grow. So rather than causing a, quote, contagion or infection, the bacteria are biodegrading that which shouldn't be there. It's a kind of bioremediation. And then if you think about it, nature can't work without this bacterial and fungal bioremediation. If you think about a forest, you cut down trees or a tree falls. If you said, I'm going to stop all bacteria and fungus from digesting the dead trees, you'd have a dead forest in no time. So these bacteria and fungus live on dead material and they biodegrade it, and it's this kind of bioremediation. So you have then two very, very interesting hypotheses of what happened here with the person. The one is the Listeria is an infection that came from the outside and making you sick. The other is it's the milk that's making you sick, and the Listeria are biodegrading the toxins in the milk, and there's no infection at all. Now, from the way I see it, either of those two are perfectly reasonable hypotheses, right? I mean, you don't know which one of those is correct. They both seem fair enough. But there is a way to figure out, because they both can't be correct. So you have to figure out which one is true. And there's a very simple and straightforward way of doing that. You take the milk with the Listeria in it, you isolate the Listeria from the milk, right? So you now feed the person pure Listeria bacteria, because that's the hypothesis of the first, is that's the problem. You feed the person Listeria and you see if they get sick. And whether the people who are listening believe it or not, there is no case that I or anybody who's looked into this knows that you can isolate a bacteria or a virus and make another human being or animal sick. Pasteur did that for 40 years, trying to make animals and eventually sometimes people sick by isolating bacteria from, dead tissue. Like you have something happens to your tonsils, you can actually find strep bacteria in your throat. Turns out they're always there, but then they grow more. They digest the dead material in your tonsils. They took the strep out, they isolated it, they gave it to somebody who was healthy, never once made anybody sick.
Wow.
And that led Pasteur to eventually say, the germ is nothing, the terrain is everything. The terrain means the milk. The bacteria are growing in the milieu, the environment, that in that case is the milk. Now, to me, the most interesting thing is, I have no dog in this fight. I look at it and I say, well, it could be the bacteria, it could be the milk. If it's the bacteria, you kill the bacteria, and if it's the milk, you stop poisoning the cow. I frankly didn't care which one it was. I just wanted to know. And so I looked into it, and it turns out it's the milk. And we should stop poisoning the cow. I mean, and then people say to me, you're not allowed to do that study. I say, why not?
What?
Yeah, what difference does it make? Like, I don't care whether it's the bacteria or the milk. If it's the bacteria, I'll kill the bacteria. But I and others have looked for 20 years, and we can't find a single study that proves it's the bacteria. So that was the first step. And then they had a lot of diseases, which, because they had a light microscope, they would look and they would try to find bacteria. And the main one was polio. So they said, here's all these sick people, and it looks like it's contagious. Never mind that you get the same sort of paralysis by exposure to lead arsenic, which started at the same time. So that could have been it. But they didn't they didn't like that theory because they didn't want to get rid of the arsenic. So they said there must be something transmissible between people smaller than a bacteria. We just can't see it. Fair enough, that's possible. So they tried to do things to expose people who weren't sick to the tissue and see if they could make them sick. So they took people who died of polio and they ground up their brains or ground up their spinal cord, and then they would feed it to an animal and see if they could give them polio, and it didn't work.
Wow.
So then they would grind up the brains and the spinal cord and inject it subcutaneously into the animal and see if it would work, and it didn't make any animals sick. And then they said an interesting conclusion, which is the trouble with studying polio is there's no animal model to study, which is an interesting conclusion, because you could also say, turns out it doesn't make animals sick, it must not be the
wow.
thing. But you could also say, well, it makes humans sick, but not animals sick. That's why it doesn't work. So that's what they said. And then in a very famous study, 1907, which I would say 99% of doctors have never heard of this study, but I do because it's my sort of business. And anybody who wants to find the reference, there's a book called Virus Mania, and he has the original study. A guy finally proved that you could transmit polio from one person to an animal. And here's what they did. They took a child who was paralyzed from polio. They took some of their spinal tissue. They ground it up in a blender. They took two monkeys. I'm not sure what kind of monkeys they were. They drilled a hole in the monkey's brain. They injected about a half a cup of unpurified spinal cord goop into these two monkeys' holes in their brain. One of the monkeys died immediately, probably from a herniation of their brain, and the other got paralyzed. And they held up the monkey who was paralyzed, and they say, see, we transmitted this virus from one person to an animal. That proves polio is a contagious disease. Now, I don't know about you, but what that first of all, they didn't purify, they didn't take any virus out. They couldn't because they didn't see any virus. They didn't know what they were looking for. And the only conclusion that I came to when I read that was, if I was a monkey and if somebody wanted to drill a hole in my brain and squirt a half a cup of diseased spinal stuff in my brain, my best bet is to run, because that may not come out well for me. Anyways, that was the classic study that showed polio was contagious, which seems a little crazy.
Wow.
And so then they go for another 30 years postulating that there was something smaller than they could see with a light microscope, but they couldn't see it because they didn't have a microscope that could see it, that was contagious and was causing polio and all kinds of other viral diseases that they couldn't pin on a bacteria. And then in the 30s came the second eureka moment, which was they invented an electron microscope. And with an electron microscope, you can take tissue from a living, animal or plant or human. You can fix it, kill it, stain it, cut it up, and you can see things much smaller than bacteria. And so they did that to people who had, diseased spinal cords or all kinds of problems. And they would see these little particles inside the tissue. And they had a circle around it, usually, so they had a sort of a membrane. And then they had stuff inside, which they could later identify as genetic material and proteins. And they said, that's it. That's the particle that we couldn't see. That's a virus, which is the name for poison. And that's what's being transmitted. Now, that's very interesting. So it could be, it's an interesting thing. They didn't know. First of all, I would again say, just because something is seen at the site of an injury doesn't mean it's the cause. Just like you can have fires and you can see firemen, and as far as I know, nobody generally thinks that firemen caused the fires, although it's, I guess, possible that a fireman did cause a fire. But usually we don't think like that. So then they decided, okay, we see these little particles. They're everywhere in every living tissue. They're more in diseased tissue than healthy tissue. So let's see what happens. So they learned how to isolate these viruses. The way you do that is you take the tissue, you grind it up in a blender, and then you filter it through a filter paper like a coffee filter, but it's way smaller, so that only the viruses and proteins and nucleic acids go through the paper. So no bacteria, no cells. And then you have more or less a jar, let's say, of stuff that's smaller than a bacteria. And then you put it in a centrifuge that has a density gradient and things separate out by weight. And you will see a band that's pure viruses. So now we've isolated the viruses. We found them in a sick person. We can pipette that virus out. We can expose people or animals to the virus and see what happens. They did this for about 20 years, and no animal or person got sick, not one. And at that point, they had one of two, the old saying goes, they came to a fork in the road, and when you come to a fork in the road, you should take it. So they did. They could have said at that point, we have disproven that viruses cause disease. It turns out that these particles are actually made by the tissues and the cells when they're poisoned. So if you take any tissue and you poison it even with fear or starve it or put glyphosate or electromagnetic fields or anything, it essentially packages up the poison and excretes it as a detoxification mechanism. It's also a mechanism of communication. It's very much analogous to if you have a tree in a forest and you have a beetle infestation of one tree, it sends out messages, including genetic messages through its roots, that tell the other trees and the bacteria and the fungus and all the other microorganisms in the forest that there's a beetle problem and you guys should make a defensive action. And that's because this idea of natural selection based on mutations is basically nonsense. There's not individual survival of the fittest. There is each tree needing the other trees in order to survive. Because if all the trees are gone and you're the only tree left, it's too hot and the sun gets you and the wind gets you and you're a goner. So you need to help the other trees and the rabbits and the squirrels and the fungus and the bacteria. That's actually how nature works. So it's the
So it
same.
needs the community. It needs
Yes,
them all.
all living beings need a community or they die. So same what happens if you get poisoned with a new poison, you can't wait 10,000 years for that mutation to spread through the whole population. That's ridiculous. So you send out this genetic message, which is called an exosome, and that tells all your friends and your neighbors and the rabbits and everybody there's a new poison in town. You guys should make a defensive action, make some protein, and they do. Sometimes it makes them seem like they're sick because they make a kind of, like detoxification reaction. They're not sick. They're just protecting themselves. So they
And
confused
and
that
and sorry,
with
what are the
virus.
signs? I'm sorry, I just wanted to make sure I understand. So what are the signs that those other animals or plants around them would show that they're protecting themselves against this new, toxin in the environment, like when the exosomes are released? So like how would
Well,
the
they might
others?
have an inflammatory response.
Okay.
It's very much like if you get a splinter in your finger and you don't take it out, you make pus to get the splinter out. The pus is the therapy for the splinter. So if you've got beetles and you need to make a protective coating around you, that looks like an inflammatory process. Unfortunately, the doctors, and in here, particularly the alternative doctors, have this ridiculous theory that inflammation is bad, so they try to get rid of it. It does cause troubles, meaning symptoms, but it's basically a way of detoxification. So the other organisms say, right, we got a new poison, let's make some enzymes and some other things that protect us. There's a certain kind of symptom, just like when the bacteria eat the dead stuff in your tonsils, you are sick, but that's the resolution process. And the way you know that is if you stop the person by killing the bacteria, eventually it just comes back again because your body has to get rid of that poison. And I know people who come back 40 times. And if you get rid of the poison, the bacteria go away and they're not sick anymore.
Would it be like the analogy of you trying to get rid of a sickness with antibiotics and just destroying all the bacteria versus making lifestyle changes or changing different removing certain toxic pollutants in the environment? Would that be a
Yes, but to be specific, the bacteria like strep throat is just eating the dead, poison tissue, and they are bioremediating as part of this resolution process. If you make a mistake and think they're the cause of the disease, then you stop the resolution and then you would predict that it will never resolve actually, and you make the person worse, which is actually what happens.
wow?
So just to get back to finish the story, so they came to the point where they couldn't demonstrate that you could take these particles and make anybody sick. And then they said, virology doesn't work. Viruses don't make anybody sick. They're just some sort of poison secretion from the cells that are used as communication. So we should all go home and be plumbers and carpenters and forget about virology. And that's where they were until this guy named Embers came along and said, I can prove that viruses cause disease. And here's how he did it. He took viruses from somebody who's sick, let's say measles virus. So person had measles and they have snot and secretions from their skin. Now, he would take a sample of those secretions that has all kinds of things in it. It has viruses, genetic material, protein, dead cells, poisons, whatever. It's got all kinds of things in it. So he would centrifuge it, which is not purifying it, and then he would inoculate a tissue like an egg or skin cells or tissue from fetuses or monkey kidney cells, right? So he took unpurified snot, essentially. He would inoculate that on a kidney tissue, sorry. and nothing happened. And then he would say, but I can make it easier for the virus, meaning the snot, to kill the tissue. All I have to do is first starve the tissue. So he would take away all the nutrients. And then he would add antibiotics, which poison the tissue. And then he would add bleach and other oxidizing agents, which basically degrade the tissue. And then the virus would kill the tissue, meaning the tissue would break down into all these different parts. And then he would say, see all these different parts, they came from the virus replicating, and that's what's called a viral culture. And that was the proof that viruses cause disease. And he got a Nobel Prize for that. And to this day, that's how we prove viruses cause disease.
Wow.
That, and then we look for the genetic material found in this, glop of stuff. You don't know whether it came from the original snot or the virus in the original snot, or was degraded monkey kidney cells that were poisoned and starved, because you don't separate anything out. And all you do is look for genetic material. And that's what a PCR test that looks for a coronavirus is. They look for genetic material that they say came from this virus, which it was never purified, so they don't actually know that it came from the virus. And they use that as the proof that this was the cause of the disease. Now, if that sounds crazy to you and your listeners, I can only say it's because it is crazy. So here's an analogy. So I'm seeing you in this, whatever, Zoom or whatever we're doing, and I just discovered that you have a flying saucer flying around your head, right? Now, you may think, well, this guy's a little crazy. How does he know that? Right?
Right.
You may think that. You may think you just believe me because I'm a doctor, but you may, if you're skeptical, you may say, so Tom, how do you know that? And I would say, well, I hear this rustling noise through the computer, and that can only be a flying saucer. And you would say, how do you know it's not the wind? Or I have a fan on because it's hot here. No, I know it's a flying saucer because only flying saucers make that kind of noise. And most people would think, this guy's batshit crazy. And then I would say, yeah, but I looked under your chair and I found little pieces of metal filings. And so I know that those metal filings must have come from a flying saucer. Now, you might believe me, or you might say, how do you know that those metal filings could have only come from a flying saucer? And I would say, because I compared it to other published flying saucer metal filings, and they said if I find these metal filings, that means it's a flying saucer. Now, if you had any skepticism or any sense, you might say, Tom, the only way I'm going to believe that these metal filings prove that it came from a flying saucer is A, if you actually have a flying saucer and you analyze the metal, and then you showed me that no airplanes or the fan above your head or anything else has these same kind of metal, right? If nothing else has that metal, and you know that flying saucers are the only thing in the universe that have that metal, then you can say these metal filings came from that.
Right.
But they never did. They never isolated the virus, and they never tested it against every other genetic material, because it turns out the genetic material in a virus is the exact same genetic material from you. So if you test it, you don't know where it came from. Unless you isolated this flying saucer and tested it, or isolated a virus, you can't say where the test came from. And I would tell your listeners, if anybody can prove that they isolated, filtered, and caused disease by any other virus or bacteria, I'm about to publish a book on this. I will stop the publication of the book and say, Tom was wrong. Germs cause disease. PCR tests are valid. But I don't think you're going to find it because we've looked for 20 years and it's not there.
Wow. So if you're listening or watching, if you have any proof to indicate what Dr. Cowan was talking about, please, leave it in the comments, and then we'll be sure and pass it on to Dr. Cowan. So the challenge is out there.
One thing about that. This way that I'm proving thing is called Koch's postulates. Those are the rules that virologists set up to prove causation. And as Koch himself said, they were never proven or fulfilled with bacteria. He didn't know about viruses. And so again, the virologists and the doctors came to a fork in the road. They could either say these postulates, which say sick people should have the bacteria or the virus, right? Not sick people should not have the bacteria or the virus. And then if you take and isolate the virus or the bacteria from sick people and you expose the not sick people, they should get sick, right? That's like basic, that's like logic. And so they decided that because it never worked, not once fulfilling Koch's postulates, they just changed the postulates and said, well, we don't have to do it like that. We can just find genetic material.
They did that for the COVID, for coronavirus, or did they do that for viruses in general?
And they did it for bacteria and viruses, the whole thing.
Wow.
They just changed the criteria for how you know. Now, the reason I say this, so some of the listeners or people who are savvy about this will say, Tom is wrong. We abandoned Koch's postulates 70 years ago, which is true, sort of. And the reason they abandoned them is because they insisted that bacteria caused disease. They couldn't prove it, so they decided to prove it another way, which was gobbledygook, basically. But the reason that's actually not true is the paper that proved that coronavirus causes COVID-19. The title of it said, "We proved Koch's postulates for coronavirus." So it's not true that they abandoned it. You can't abandon logic. So, but the thing is, so people will send you that paper. See, they fulfilled Koch's postulates. I can tell you though, I read that paper very carefully. They didn't fulfill one postulate, nor did they even try to isolate a virus. In fact, a guy that I know who's a sort of friend of a friend, he did a whole piece on this, and he asked the author of the paper, who said, we isolated the virus. He said, did you attempt to isolate the virus? And he said, no, we never attempted to isolate or purify the virus. So he said, why did you put that in the title of your paper? That was the most cited paper that this is the cause. And then he didn't answer.
Wow.
And all of the 6 papers who claim, one of them was the isolation of a novel virus from the first COVID-19 patient in South Korea. So we asked him, did you isolate the virus? Because he didn't show any pictures of it, and he didn't describe an isolation procedures. And he said, we did not attempt isolation or purification. It's just, think about it. Like, why did you write that in the title of your paper then?
Wow,
My
total
point
deception.
People will send me things that say the title of the paper says they did. And I guess they expect me to believe that without reading the paper, which is a bit bizarre because I think I'm still allowed to read the paper and actually see whether they did that. Maybe that's illegal now, but it used to be,
right?
it used to be legal that a doctor could actually read the paper and know what method they used or didn't use to isolate, purify, and show transmission, and only to find out they didn't do any of those things. And here's another example. There was a study in Nature, I think it was 2020, April 2020, showing the effectiveness of masks for reducing transmission of the virus.
Right.
So first of all, I just did a blog on that paper. It's very interesting. First of all, they never found a virus. They only find genetic material, which they have no evidence actually came from the virus. And then, amazingly, so the title is Reduction of Transmission Through Masks. Then in the body of the paper, they say, and I don't have the quote, but it's something like, we didn't assess transmission or infectivity of the virus. So they never tried to see whether the virus was transmissible or effective, even though that was the point of the paper.
Unbelievable. And that's a great point. Yeah, because I've been talking to, other, MDs, and many of them, before this paper, they would say, oh, masks, no, there's no indication that it's effective. But then recently, they're advocates for it, and it's like, what changed? They're like, oh, well, research has changed. There's been some new research to show that it's effective, and I think that's what you're referring to.
Exactly. And then to make it even worse, and this is a little technical, at the end of it, so they use this test called a PCR test, which looks for genetic material. And that other thing that I described is called a viral culture. You take unpurified snot, you starve and poison a tissue, and then you see if it grows. And that's called the gold standard for assessing viruses. It's nonsense, but let's just say for a minute it is the way we prove that there are viruses. So they found 6 people who transmitted influenza virus through a mask. 6 people. They found a virus. They didn't find the virus. They found PCR positive, right? So that's what they found. So of those 6, they took 4 of them and did a viral culture on 4 of them to check on the PCR test, right? You with me?
Yep.
And of the 4, 2 showed the presence of the influenza virus and 2 were negative. And they didn't comment on this. That means when they checked their PCR test, it was correct 2 times and incorrect the other 2 times. In other words, 50% of the time they say they found a virus transmitted, they actually didn't find the virus when they did a culture and checked.
Wow. Okay, so you were saying, so the 50%, so of the 4 cultures that were tested, so 2 came back as negative.
Yeah, no growth.
Two came back as no growth, and then the other 2 came back
growth, which means
growth.
The PCR test, according to their own numbers, admittedly small and insignificant numbers, but that's the only check they did. I agree. It would have been better to do 500 samples, but they only did 4. I don't know why.
Wow.
But their own testing showed that their way of assessing whether the virus was present was no better than a coin flip.
Unbelievable.
And they didn't comment on that. In other words, they invalidated the whole methodology of their study, which was to assess viral presence with a test, which then they show doesn't accurately assess the presence of a virus. It's only 50% accurate. 50% is 0%, essentially.
Right.
That's a coin flip.
Exactly.
You might as well say, is the virus there or not? Heads, yes. Tails, no. Good. End of study. $1 million. Thank you very much.
There you go. Unbelievable.
I mean, that's where we're at.
Wow. So that was amazing. And it's just what you just outlined to me is that the entire foundation of our modern medical approach, our mainstream medical, allopathic medical approach is entirely shaky. And going back from all the way from the germ theory to the way that the virus for the coronavirus is being studied, and the way that these things are put in the way that the titles of these studies are labeled compared to what's in the substance. Like when you're saying, when you actually read it and seeing that they're not proving it, they're not attempting to isolate a virus. And it just tells me that the entire foundation is, I mean, it's like the emperor has no clothes on, and it's like you're the one who's done the research to identify that and speak that. And it's like, for that, what's the reward? Censorship. What's the reward? All of these articles on from mainstream media sites, just vilifying, or just saying here's why Dr. Cowan's wrong, and not listing providing substantive evidence. And it's just like unbelievable. This whole foundation is just, it has no strength. It has no stability. And thank you for outlining that. That's just mind-boggling.
There's a lot of interesting sidelights, but here's where this trouble got started. I mean, it got started a long time ago, but here's really where it got started. And again, I am not a researcher, so let's be clear. I'm not even, quote, a scientist. I am a trained medical doctor who tries to help sick people not be poisoned and get better. But I don't do any research, and I don't like even the word scientist, because I'm not doing any, quote, science. I'm just reading stuff and hopefully thinking about whether that doesn't make any sense. But really it got started, and I stole this from Goethe, so I just want to be clear, because I don't know if this is a quote, but he pointed out that Western science went wrong when they decided that if you want to know about a frog, like let's say you want to know what makes a frog work and how to help a frog and why frogs get sick and what a frog is made of and all that, right? You want to know everything you can find out to understand and help frogs. And you know what the first thing we do is? Kill the frog. Right?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, you're right. Wow.
So now the frog's dead. And I can tell you one thing for sure is it didn't help that frog. Because now we kill 500,000 frogs. And we cut them up, dissect them, try to find out what makes a frog work. And Goethe pointed out that if you want to know what makes a frog work and how to help frogs, you should spend a lot of your time observing how frogs live in nature. Because if you do that, you will find out what makes a living frog work. You see, we don't have a theory of life. In fact, we actually are, we being, Western science, we are antagonistic to the concept of life. We say that if things can't be measured or quantified, they don't exist. Whenever I'm in a sort of debate with somebody who says, we're scientists, we only believe in things we can measure or quantify. And of course, then I say, do you love your wife? By the way, I have her on the phone right here, so you better answer that. Of course, they say yes. And I say, how much? 12. Out of what? 18 or 64? So, no, you can't quantify that. You just told me 2 minutes ago that if you can't measure and quantify it, it doesn't exist. So therefore, you must not love your wife. Right. And by the way, I'm going to call her and tell her, because you just said you don't believe in that. My point is, we get told things about the way the world is, which frankly none of us believe, because it's nonsense. That's not anybody's actual experience of life.
Exactly.
And we believe because we experience love and emotions and life, and there's a difference between a dead frog and a living frog. Now, and we don't necessarily know what that's about, but we all know there's a difference. We know that this theory that only that which can be measured and quantified is real is totally bogus. I mean, I'd love to see a double-blind study proving that. As far as I know, it doesn't exist. And so the whole thing is basically a kind of house of cards. And out of that, we, can do certain things. But one thing we can't do is understand life or why people get sick or why people get better.
Wow. Unbelievable. That's a great, very palpable example that I think everyone can relate to. Even the most, quote unquote, scientific, amongst us. How much do we love your work?
They think somehow your mind, not your mind, they don't know where a mind is. They think your brain secretes emotions called love. There's some chemical that your brain makes that makes you have the experience of love. So they're going to download that into a computer, and then you'll have love all the time. Except I don't want to live in that world.
Yeah, there's no. It's like when you make something, machine-like, and it's you want to like you said, just excrete it or put it out, all the time. It's like you lose the value of it, and it's just that humane and that appreciation is like you need the yin and the yang in order to have the appreciation of, of just all the different wonderful things in life. And it's like artificial intelligence.
Yeah, we have a science that is antagonistic to life, and that is why we're in this mess. And it's not a nice mess either, I can tell you that.
Yeah, I think now, people are experiencing that firsthand.
Yeah, this is a bad mess. All right.
Wow, unbelievable. Dr. Cowan, thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom. Where can people go to learn more about your work and about your great products and your books? What's the best place for people?
Yeah, we have a new website called drtomcowan.com, TOMCOWAN, and pretty much all of our initiatives are going to either are or will be compiled there. And if there's a way to get the newsletters and blogs and keep up with what we're doing. And I do hope people join me and comment and just let me know what you're thinking.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So you guys definitely visit Dr. Cowan's new website, drtomcowan.com. These great books and products. Definitely check them out. Highly, highly encourage everyone. And we'll be sure and get the links out and post them in the video description as well. And again, just wanted to thank everyone for watching. And Dr. Cowan, thank you so, so much. It's truly been an honor and very eye-opening experience.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone.